Hopefully it records the right way. All right, let's see. Does anyone see a red, does it show a red button when it's recording? Okay, I see it now. Okay. All right. Okay, so just today's agenda. I'm just going to give you a brief introduction, which I already did. I'm going to give you some updates and some data news. Then our guest speaker is going to be talking to us today. That's James. He's going to be speaking about data storytelling. And then we can just feel free after he's finished presenting to ask him some questions, and then we'll just have a quick closing. Okay, so let me just submit these people. Let me hit admit all. So about dynamic communities, they will be soon closing the website. They did close it earlier, and they had their new page, but there were so many issues with the new page that they had to open the older one. So I had moved the group to meetup.com. So just please go to there for all updates. I'm not sure when they're closing the old site. So just be aware that it will be closing soon. And once they get the new site running well, I will put the link on the Meetup site. You can see here, though, I included it. I'm going to put the slides on Teams so that you can get all these links. Okay, let's move on. So just for the women here or anybody else, there's a Power BI Women Meetup tomorrow. It's February 10th at 7 p.m. So feel free to join that if you like. It's a group to support all Power BI women. Its mission is to grow the number of women users, and its mission is also to expose more girls to Power BI. The next group that just came out is Latinas in Data. This is for anyone. I don't know how many of you know Gilda, but she is the organizer of this group, and she's just looking to take people in to help them learn about technology. So if you're interested, just go to meetup.com and just put Latinas in Data. They have their meeting February 25th, and it's from 7 to 8 p.m. And there's also going to be a data conference, Power Platform virtual conference. It's going to be March 11th through the 12th. I'm not sure if it's a free conference. I think it may be since it's virtual. Please feel free to check it out. If you just go to Google and hit Power Platform, it should come right up. It's a lot of, looks like it's going to be a lot of good presentations on Power BI. I think maybe some other platforms as well. So please feel free to check that out. And then looking for work. I had someone contact me the other day, and they are looking to hire some new employees. They're looking for an ETL developer for SSIS packages. He's also looking not for Power BI, but Tableau. So if you got experience in both of them, that's good. He's looking for a BI developer in Tableau. If you're interested, feel free to contact Brian Tira, and his email is below. Okay. So our next meetup, just wanted to let you know, it's going to be March 9th. I put maybe 6 to 7. If anybody wants a different time and kind of more towards 11, 11:30, let me know if that works better for you, and I can try to organize it with Patrick. And it's going to be Patrick from Guy in a Cube. He said he will do it. I just have to follow up with him because I haven't heard back. And I just want to make sure, I just want to confirm with him. So I'm going to be doing that after the meeting. But he is the one that I'm planning to have speak to us next month. Okay. And all right, James. So he's going to be speaking to us today about data storytelling. So I'm going to let him take over.
Thanks a lot, Priscilla. I'm going to share my screen now, if I can find out how to do that. Yeah, seems like that's the way. Do you have a picture of me looking scared in a kitchen with velociraptors chasing me? It's a terrible situation here in Africa. We have wild animals roaming the streets. People don't believe me, but this is really where I am right now. So I apologize if there's any loud noises or anything. Actually, if they're loud noises, it's my bassets. But we'll pretend they're velociraptors because it's more fun that way. My name is James. I am coming from, as I say, from South Africa, from Johannesburg. It's just going on 6:30 in the evening here. It's a beautiful summer's evening. We've had like 3 continuous weeks of rain, which is very unusual for us. So it's really nice to have some sunshine. Yeah, anyway, so thank you for giving up your lunch hour to listen to me. And I'm not Patrick from Guy in the Cube, so I apologize for that, but I'll do my best to hopefully give you a presentation that you'll enjoy. We are going to talk about data storytelling today. I think, oh, that's not the right screen. That's the right screen. First, I need to tell you a little story about this. I was approached by my agent, and they said to me, you got to book the 4 seasons. And I did that. And then the pizza arrived at my house, and I was like, I don't understand what the point is. And then they told me that they meant something totally different. So hopefully that's the only mistake I'm going to make in terms of misunderstandings and things. But I've been told that the 4 seasons is a big thing, and I should actually have booked something else. So I apologize for that. There's also that's just silliness. There's my LinkedIn and Twitter handles if you are interested. Okay, on to proper stuff. So, why is my slideshow not going anywhere? There we go, slideshow. There we go. So, why do we tell stories? And we start right here at sort of this primordial level. It's a very primal thing for us to tell stories and to relate to the art of storytelling rather than other things, because we create an emotional connection. So when we work with data specifically, we have a product, but it's quite difficult to communicate that. It's quite difficult to work through that. I'm going to switch my camera off so I'm out of the way. That didn't work. There we go. We can make our data better by enriching it with visuals. And this is a fairly common thing. We all know that data, visuals, graphs, charts are better than raw data. It's easier to commit to, it's easier to convince someone to communicate that with pictures rather than words. But what we're really aiming for is something even that creates even more of a connection. And that's what we call a narrative or a story that people can become engaged in. But actually we need all 3 of these things, because a narrative, every story has a narrative, but not every story has data. So a story like a fairy tale or whatever, it has a story, you create an emotional connection, but you can't communicate data that way. So we need this combination of the 3. We need data, visuals, and a narrative. And where we get those 3, that's our peak point of how we communicate effectively with our audience, whoever our audience may be. So in this session today, what do you think? What would I like us to do? Well, first we're gonna take some data. It's going to be a very simple data set, and hopefully a data set that everyone can relate to quite easily. And we're going to explore it a little bit just to understand the basics of what it is. Then we're going to explore some stories. We're actually going to take that data set, which is fairly mundane and boring, and we're going to create a set of data stories. And we're going to work through them step by step as to how we actually create those stories. And then we're going to explain what we've done, because creating a data story is not an accidental thing. It's not something that happens. It's a process that we have to follow to actually get through. So we'll look at some stories, and then I'm going to go back and I'm going to explain how those stories were formed and why certain choices were made at the time. Okay. So I've taken this slide, or I've adapted this slide from a book by a lady named Cole Nussbaumer Knaflick, who wrote a book called Storytelling with Data, which is an excellent resource for this kind of what we're talking about today: storytelling, data storytelling, and creating a narrative and a connection with an audience. And what she talks about is there are 5 basic steps. The first one is to understand the context of your data, because if you don't have context, numbers mean nothing. Numbers are just, they're numbers on a scale, they're points, but they don't actually mean anything Once you understand the context, it's easier to choose the right visuals to communicate those, whatever it is that you're looking at, in the right way. Then a very important step, and it sounds weird to do this right now, but it's critical to clean up our visuals and data and make them as simple to follow as possible. Too many times we end up in a situation where our stories are cluttered and too difficult to follow because we haven't taken the necessary time to actually do the cleanup work before we look at things like our pre-attentive attributes, and I'll talk about that is just now. But essentially it's highlighting or focusing on certain things, and how we do that so that if a person looks at our presentation, our data story, they have 3 or 4 things that they take away from it. And those are our pre-attentive attributes. That is those are the 4 things we want someone to focus on, and they may be anywhere on our report. So how do we do that? And then the last step, once you've done all the groundwork, only then do you actually tell the story. So that's my sort of 5-step plan, and you're going to see that in action as we go along in this session. Cool. So the first thing before we actually look at Power BI, I just want to talk about some of the storytelling devices or some of the storytelling elements in Power BI, some of the things we can use, the tools that we can use to make our stories better. The first one is bookmarks. Now, bookmarks is an incredibly powerful feature. It can be frustrating occasionally, especially when you start your bookmarks too early, but it's a really, really wonderful feature to maintain certain data views, to keep certain sort of stories or certain data sets alive, and to be able to reference them very quickly. And that's a very powerful tool. Using buttons for storytelling is also a very powerful mechanism where we can either show or hide or change our visuals. We can use it to reference our bookmarks by storing filters or contexts. There's a whole bunch of different things we can do by using buttons, but the look and feel of a button makes it really engaging for a user. So it's also an important device. The next thing is drill through, and I think the one after that is drill down. No, it's not. Okay, so let's drill through. Obviously, we don't want to overclutter a user's view to start with. So we give them the possibility to drill into more detail if they want it, or on a specific data point. We don't try and present everything in one view. And that's just a function of not trying to overwhelm our users and to use our real estate wisely. I always try and limit my visualizations to a maximum of 4 charts and 3 KPIs or cards. That's it. If I go more than that, I feel like it gets a bit cluttered. Occasionally I do, but that's generally the kind of the numbers I'm looking at. And then I use drill through and drill down and tooltips to keep those numbers low. Then obviously Q&A. It's a funny feature. I love Q&A. When I show people Q&A in demos and customer engagements and things, they go crazy. But I haven't really had a massive use case in production yet where people are actually using it that much. But I do like it. I think there are use cases, particularly if you've got people out in the field and they're using their phones on Power BI. It's really cool to have Q&A. It's one of the things I won't demo today, and this is the other one, is AI or ML. We don't really have enough time to look at those 2 features, but they are nice to know that they're there, and it's important to know that we can use them for our stories. This one we will have a look at, scatter charts with play axes. Moving data charts have become a lot more popular recently. They were, for a long time, they were discouraged, but I think there's been a bit of a boom, especially with GIFs and the sort of sharing on the internet where people are more happy to have moving charts. And you're seeing them a lot in terms of like biggest companies over time and total car sales over time in these like what they call racing bar charts. So Power BI does give us a chance to do that ourselves. It's quite a nice one to look at. I particularly like doing it with scatter charts because for me, it gives you a really nice view of how things change over time. And then the last one in this list is just tooltips. And this is also in terms of similarly to what I was talking about with drill through, not using too much real estate on a page, being able to give the user, the customer, more access to data or access to more data without overwhelming them and overloading their cognitive, overloading their cognitive load by putting too much on a single thing. So these are very important things, and we'll have a look at most of them through the course of our demos. I'm going to pop through these slides and not really talk about them because this talk can go up to an hour and a half long. But and I know you guys have lunch and you don't have that much time. So the important thing is that a narrative arc is a storytelling device in terms of literature. This is how people write stories, and if we understand how that works, it's easier for us to follow that kind of logic when writing our own stories. And it's pretty simple. We give some information, we show how something changed, we get to a moment, a turning point where we either have to take action or we did take action, and then we have to show what may happen or what has happened. And that is essentially what we're doing with every data story. And you'll see that there, I've kind of put this. I'll send Priscilla a link to these slides so she can share them with anyone who wants them in a little bit more detail. But we'll go through this process, so you'll actually see me do this rather than hear me talking about it, because practice is always more fun than theory. So I'm going to talk very briefly here about what we call exploratory data stories. Exploratory data stories is basically, how do we design when we don't know what the questions are that the user is going to ask? So this is our basic Power BI type questions. You know, how do I design a report that people can interact with and can answer a variety of questions, not knowing which way they're going to go? So actually, let's go into an example, and then we'll talk about the choices we make. So let me pop into Power BI. I don't quite know why it's so far away. And you should, are you seeing Power BI now? There you go. So here we have a Power BI report that I've put together. Now, I know like 2 minutes ago, I said I only put 4 visuals and 3 cards on a report. And here I have 6 visuals and 4 cards. So bad, James. But this data is very, very simple. And I actually want to, these 2 visuals on the right are essentially one visual split up into 2 parts. And that's actually the only thing I can justify. So it should be 5 visuals and one report. If I had I could have done a hurricane chart here, I guess. But anyway, so this data set comes from the US Census Bureau. And every year they take a census of all the babies born in the USA. And what we get out of that is essentially the name of the child. We get the sex that they were assigned at birth. We get which state they were born in and how many of them there were. So my data set is really not very exciting. That's all it is. And we're going to use that because it's something we can all sort of relate to, and we're going to tell some stories. So just in terms of an exploratory data report, what I've set up here is I asked a couple of people some questions as to what were the things they were most likely to be interested in. And they said essentially they would want to see the number of kids born per year. Okay, so that's this top left-hand chart, number of babies by year and sex. And obviously in this is well, I'll talk about, sorry, let me move on. And then the number of unique names. This was something that a couple of people said to me, like, how have naming sort of standards or naming conventions changed over time in terms of what people are calling their children? Back from the sort of 1890s, I think this data starts in, 1910, this data starts in, to the 2010s. How have these kinds of things changed? Are there more names? Are there fewer names? So that was the second chart. Then this one for me was quite interesting because my name is James, and J is a pretty uncommon letter in the English language, but you find lots and lots of people with names that start with J. So I wanted to sort of think about the idea of how the correlation was between letters of the alphabet, first letters of the alphabet in terms of words and the dictionary in English versus first letters of names. So that's why I created this sort of grouping by initial. And then building on the idea of the number of unique names, I had, if you take the top 10 most popular names in a given time period, what percentage of all children born in that time had one of those 10 names? Because when I looked early on, when I looked at this data, I noticed this very first data point on the far left, that in the 1910s, 35 or 36% of all children had born, or all males born, had one of 10 names. And for me, that was a staggering thing to think that every one in three people that you walked into would have one of 10 names. That's it. Like I was, and then I thought back to when I was in school, and I was like, oh, actually, maybe that's not so unusual, because there were 3 Davids and 2 Jameses and 5 Michaels, and and suddenly, yeah, it makes sense. One of three people had one of those names. So, yeah, it was just an idea of something that would be interesting to explore, and how has that changed over time. And then the last two are obviously these 2 graphs on the right-hand side in terms of the most popular male names, the most popular female names. Now, we know that just looking at this, it's entirely static. There's not a lot that you can necessarily click on or interact with. There's 1 or 2 things. So you could choose, the number of males in, why is my interactive thing not working? Oh, because I'm clicking on the wrong screen. I apologize. I am a fool. There we go. So if I'd looked at only sort of the whatever year that is, 1969, and males, I would get a different report. And if I, played around with maybe a specific letter, like the female J's, I would get a different report. So I do have those options, but I also included these slices at the top, which obviously allows me to be a little bit more granular with the kind of stuff I'm looking for. So we can say, is there a big difference between, for instance, Arkansas and something else like Delaware? So we've got these options. We've got some stuff. I couldn't think of more questions that a person was likely to come with and ask just randomly. So that's the kind of thought process that went into designing this report. So basically, that's where we are. And that's kind of the decisions I made. So I'm going to now go back to the slideshow and actually talk about the physical decisions that I made in that time. Let's just see. Yeah, that's right. Okay. So the first one was the use of appropriate visuals. So if you think back to that report, we had essentially line charts, bar charts, cards, tables. There was nothing really that was at all complicated. I didn't expect my users to know any sort of fancy box and whisker charts or analytical, histograms or anything like that. Even though they may not be that complicated, I'm not asking users to go far outside of their comfort zone. And when I work with exploratory data, that's something I always keep in mind. Try and keep my visuals as simple and as well known as possible. Secondly, the use of color. Now, there's a couple of things to note there. The first one is that I didn't use the traditional blue and pink in my visualization, even though that would possibly have made life a bit easier for someone because of the strong associations with those 2 colors in terms of representing sex. But there's a fairly large growing movement around the world about not using blue and pink to represent male and female. So in terms of, catering to people and that, I chose to use this blue and purple, green and purple color palette, which is the official Washington Times and sort of color palette when representing this kind of data. So I've used something that is sort of a standard, although not everyone will have seen it, but I did choose that one. There was a specific reason for it, but also it plays into the fact that it was designed by an artist, that color palette, which means that the the colors have already been checked for things like color blindness, like visual, sorry, I've lost the word now, the difference between them, contrast between them. So really this palette was designed with people in mind, and hopefully there shouldn't be any issues for anyone to interpret the data because of my color choices. So that's something we have to consider. The third one, obviously I talked about filters, but providing filters on the most commonly accessed data makes it easier for our users to make decisions and to play around with the kind of questions that they want to ask. And the last one is the visual header tooltip. Now this one I didn't look at, so let's quickly pop back into Power BI and go back in there. So I explained to you this concept of the number of babies with the 10 most popular names, but it's not necessarily something really simple. Number of babies, really simple. You don't need an explanation. Number of unique names, you don't need an explanation. This one may be a little bit more complicated. So what I've done there is I've put on this visual header tooltip where you can hover over it and actually get a more detailed explanation as to what it is exactly that I'm representing with this number. I like to do this with all vaguely complicated measures. In fact, we should probably just do it with all measures, but you know, we don't, because we're lazy by sort of by default. That's our default settings. But it is a good idea, if you can, to explain your measures and the calculations and things like that. I've got a couple of others where, if I remember, I'll show you later on in the slow way. I've got a calculation that's a little bit complex, and also put in a thing to show what that is. Okay, so that's exploratory data sets. That's not to do with actual data storytelling, but that's just the idea. But what we do is we then take those principles and extend them when we're talking about what we call explanatory data storytelling, or explanatory reports, which is the idea of designing for information that you know how you want to present. So if you're creating a presentation for management and you have certain points that you want to highlight, if you are creating something for a poster or a infographic or anything like that, where we know the data that we want to present, that's where storytelling really it comes into its own. And that's where we can actually work on our stories and make sure they make sense, because we know the flow of the data. So let's go back and tell our first data story, and then we'll come back and look at the decisions again. So if I go into Power BI and we go out of our exploratory reports, and we go to our data stories, we can start with some stories. So the first one I'm going to talk to you about is the population growth. So here's a story, and this story basically originated from that very top leftmost graph on our exploratory report. So you will see that is the same graph that we had before. Now, what we know is, in this specific case, what we are going to do is we're going to look at growth rates overall. So one of the things we don't really need in this graph is we don't need a split between male and female, because our overall growth rate, no matter what happens, that number is never really going to change. You're always going to have around about 50% males and 50% females being born in a year. So we're not really particularly interested in that split. It just adds what we call cognitive load. You're trying to look, is there something that I'm trying to show you? And in this case, it doesn't mean anything. So the first thing we do here is we're actually going to say, well, I don't want to make this harder than it needs to be, so I'm going to clean it up slightly. And that's what we get on this first chart now on the left. I'm still using two colors, but the colors are now used to do something totally different. And you can see that in order to not confuse anyone, I've gone with two totally separate colors. I'm not using the same color like one of the two colors that I had before. I've got two different colors. And in particular, I've chosen a gray. I do this quite a lot, and Cole talks about it in her book as well, is using a gray as a base color and then a highlighting color to talk about a specific data point or range. In this case, we're talking about a range. So that's what I've done. I've also added on the right-hand side a a little explanation of what my interpretation of the data is. So the number of babies born per year has stayed relatively constant. If you look at that orange section of the graph, that kind of, I hope that you agree with me, it's relatively consistent across those 30 years. However, the US population has continued to grow. So that's my bottom graph here. You can see that the population is carrying on going up and up and up. Additional data is required for completeness of analysis. So why do I say that? Well, there are two contributing factors to how a population can grow if the number of children being born each year is not changing. And if I wanted to present a specific, if I wanted to make this into a specific political point, or I wanted to use this, I could use these two charts and then overlay it with a story about how no one is being born, but the population is growing, and therefore there must be a massive scourge of immigration. But that is not true. That is absolutely not true. And it's important for us to always think about what factors could also be in play here, because the bigger contributor here in terms of the population continuing to grow is the fact that people are living for longer. So people who were even though there are fewer babies being born, people are surviving longer, and therefore the population will obviously be growing. And you can tell from that graph that as population basically has never stopped getting older, it's just tailing off now, which is interesting, but it's you're expected to live almost 1.5 times as long, more than 1.5 times as long now as you were in the 1910s. And that makes a big difference to our overall population. So I think the important point here is the fact that we know that this is a contributing factor. I don't have any immigration or emigration data, so I can't tell you what effect that is having. But because of that, what I've chosen to do is actually to highlight the fact that I realize there is an additional factor that I can't present, and that's really an ethical decision in terms of making sure that people understand and realize that you are not trying to mislead them. And it's definitely something that if you're doing data journalism or using this in sort of papers and things like that, it's really important to consider the ethical implications of the data you're presenting, and to think about things that are maybe not apparent at first viewing. So here's a little story that I've just put together. You can see that basically what this story shows is this, the tale of three graphs. The population, the growth, the birth rate is not changing. We're having similar number of babies born each year. The population, however, is getting bigger. Why is that? Well, one of the contributing factors is the life expectancy, but there could be others which we don't have sufficient data for. And that is an entire data story. Hopefully, I have sort of given you some context. I've given you some background. I've given you enough data in the preceding period that you can sort of understand that it is unusual that for a whole period of 30 years, the rate hasn't changed. But I've then supplemented it with other data sources to try and back up whatever assertion I'm making. In this case, I'm actually not making an assertion, but that is my story. That is a complete story. So let's quickly pop into our slideshow and see some of those decisions actually justified sort of in terms of pictures. So the first thing, just remove clutter. So that was that very first step I did where I took out an unnecessary color. It didn't contribute to making the story any clearer. It had no value. So I got rid of it to make it easier for the user to understand. The second thing here is the repetition. So by using a consistent fonts, colors, and sizes, what I do is I get you familiar with the concepts that I'm trying to present. So if we look back at that, you can see that in every year, in every one of those three graphs, the orange section represents the same 30 years. And this is also something that we have to consider in terms of the ethical viewpoint, because sometimes you'll see people manipulating these kinds of things by either changing changing the ranges, or by having like a 10-year scale, and then suddenly 1 year, and then breaking it down by month. So it looks like data is changing dramatically, where actually it's not fair reflection. So all of these things should come into our consideration when we're interpreting data, but more specifically when we're presenting data. We must ensure that people are aware of what we're trying to tell, and they never lose confidence that we are trying to be completely honest and transparent in the data we are presenting. So back there, a couple of other things. Show the full picture. I've talked about this. This is the ethical thing. Don't be tempted to leave out visuals that don't suit your story. Highlighting things that you don't know to ensure that your audience keeps on trusting you. And I can't stress how important it is. Once you lose your audience's trust, once you lose your customers' trust, they won't believe a single other thing that you present to them. So it's really, really important to ensure that if there is something you don't know, make sure that people know, or there's something that you don't know. Make sure that it's highlighted or it's pointed out so people don't think you're trying to hoodwink them. And then the last one, when data is stationary, the use of text will improve clarity. So you saw that in that story. I basically explained each graph one at a time and built on it to create the little story. But you'll see it throughout the rest of the stories we look at now, because the more we actually use text, the less ambiguity there is, the less chance there is that someone can misinterpret or misunderstand what it is that you're trying to show. So that's some real basics. If you're going to tell data stories, those 4 things are really, really important. Make sure that you don't overwhelm your audience. Make sure that you keep things consistent, because it'll lessen the cognitive load for them. Make sure you show the full picture, and try and summarize by using text, because it'll get rid of any chance of ambiguity. Okay, so now we're going to move on to maybe something that's a little bit, we've got a basic story. Now we're going to look at how do we make our story a little bit better? What can we do to make this story, what can we do to take it to the next level? So we will hop back into Power BI and we will look maybe at, let's look at that story. That's a good story to look at. So here I've taken these 2 charts that were on our exploratory report again, and I've put them on the top of my report. So these 2 graphs are sort of they're the opposites of each other. I've lost the word that I'd like to explain, but essentially when one goes up, the other goes down, because the greater number of unique names that are given, the fewer and fewer people will have one of those most popular names. That's fairly intuitive, and it makes a lot of sense. So what I then thought of doing was going, okay, well, how do we enhance this story? Because this story, I suspect that if I'd asked anybody, you would have been able to tell me this story before we even looked at the data. It kind of makes sense. People are more adventurous with names now, and you get a much greater diversity of names. So that in and of itself is not a very exciting story. So what can we do to make it a bit more interesting? Well, what I tried to do was to see if there was something, if there was differences when I looked at different areas of the United States. Was there a story to be told by looking there? And because I wanted to look at the areas, my default choice was to use a map. But what I find when I look at this map is that actually I don't think that map's very useful. It's hard for me to tell something like if I'm comparing Montana to Maine, or if I'm comparing Montana to New York, how they actually are they actually different from each other, or are they similar, or that kind of thing. So those kinds of things are different. And it's also difficult for me to compare the males versus the females, because I don't have a scale on this map. It's quite difficult. So you can see if I hover over Wyoming there, I get 13.74%. If I hover over Wyoming there, I get 25%. But there's no discernible difference in terms of the intensity of the colors. So that's a really poor example of how to visualize your data. There's so much missing there. You're missing the ability to really compare stuff against each other. You're missing the ability to compare the two graphs against each other. And more than that, you're missing a scale. So that's a really poor presentation of that data. So even though I'm now showing geographic data, I decided not to use maps anymore. I decided to present it differently because this didn't make sense to me and it didn't work. So what I did was I changed it into a very, very simple data table. And I find that this is a much easier view. I can compare males to females. Overall, I've got these totals here that I can compare males to females. I can compare different states to each other. They're currently not in alphabetical order. They're sorted by an overall figure. But it's easy for me if I do want to compare Mississippi, even if I want to compare my Mississippi females to my Montana females, I can do that because the numbers are very clear and they're documented. And actually, this just works better. This story is just easier to understand if you use this specific visual rather than the default. So the importance there is not necessarily about the story. We're not actually telling a story here. It's more about the process of how you think about your presentation, how you think about your audience engagement and your users, and how they're going to consume your report. And what was the last thing we did? Well, what I did is I essentially added in some text again. Now, this text, none of it has anything to do with the actual states, so I didn't really split that up. But I did explain the basic premise of this report, that there was a fairly steady increase in the number of unique names, but it's been dropping off. Females have always had a larger variety of names, but the gap has widened over time. That's there. But recently, the gap has started to narrow. It's become more acceptable to give males more out there names, whereas previously it was only sort of done for females. And then the last thing here is that historically the concentration of the most popular names has been more than twice as large in men. I don't know why I said twice as large. It's not actually, it's like 1.5, 1.6 times as much. But in 2009, for the first time, women had a higher percentage of babies with the 10 most popular names than men. And this one was interesting for me because I'm sort of at the age where quite a few of my friends have kids, very young kids, born in the last 5 years. And it's really true. The boys have fairly diverse names amongst the whole group, and the girls seem to have fairly concentrated around 3 or 4 names between my various friendship groups. There's lots of Isabellas, lots of Olivias, so lots of Caitlins. So yeah, it's interesting to know that this kind of thing that you're seeing in the data is also actually prevalent in your own experience. So let's pop back to Power BI. To PowerPoint. It's the other one, and have a look at some of those decisions we made and how we document them. Oh, I didn't highlight this at all. Sorry, I forgot about that. Let's go back into Power BI. Each of my graphs in this case has a very descriptive title. You know, I'm not calling this, names over time, or popular names over time, or popular, something like that. I've actually tried to give them descriptive titles that actually explain what's going on. The number of unique names has increased over time, or fewer and fewer people have one of the 10 most popular names over time. So you can, without even reading my overall text, I've already given you an indication of what that graph is showing by using a good title. So that is definitely something that you can use as a tool. Another one here, and this is, I always look to the Pirates of the Caribbean for inspiration with lots of things. And this is a very important one, because there are lots of best practices. Best practices are fairly standard, but a lot of the time you need to actually look at them and decide whether they work best for you. And that's what I did with those maps. If you the best practices, if you're going to represent geographical data, represent it with a map. For me, that is more like a guideline than an actual rule, because it worked better in a table. So you're allowed to think about your visuals, and you're allowed to make judgment calls and not use best practices if they make sense in your specific situation. Again, positioning, think about how you position visuals. And this again is something I did with that table. I found that the positioning of the maps, didn't matter what I did, I couldn't give my user what I was hoping to allow them to do. So I did try various positions. I did try various ways of presenting that data on the maps. But remember that I was presenting percentages. So you can't present like a percentage versus a percentage in a pie chart, for instance. You know, you've got those maps with the bubbles. You can't do that. So yeah, it was a pretty tough thing to do, to try and present that decently on a map. So I decided to change it up, and that came into my thinking as well, was the positioning. And then the last thing here was just making our text even better. And that, again, I didn't really talk about it, because you can see that what I've done here is I've highlighted certain points. I've added in a left and an above to explain which chart is talking about which, that kind of thing, just to make my text slightly better, more like what you would expect from a journalist or a really good quality presentation, rather than, you know, a slapdash trying to be funny guy like me. So so that's something to think about, is how can you make it better for your user? What can you do to try and make that situation work better? Okay, so we have talked about basics. We've talked about how to make them slightly better. Let's go on and talk about a couple of additional design tools. Now, I mentioned these obviously in my introduction. Sorry, just having a sip of water. I talked about these in the introduction, but let's talk about how we can actually use them in a design tool to make these things slightly better. So Power BI, and we go to story number 3. Now, I basically talked about the origin of the story in the introduction section. And the first one is the distribution of the first letter of baby names versus English words. So basically, I went and I downloaded an English dictionary. I got a list of every single word in English. I grouped them by their first letter, and I worked out where those fit on a scale. So if you look at that, that's this obviously our horizontal scale. So whatever that is, 9.4% of all words in English start with the letter P. 8.67% start with the letter C. So that's what I mapped on my horizontal scale, on my x-axis. On my y-axis, I represented the number of babies born. And there you get things like here, where we look at it and we get that 9.4% of all babies were born using the letter, who were born started with the letter M. So that is the story I sort of talked about, and you can see that as per my initial thing that triggered this, J is a massive outlier in terms of names. Less than 1%, less than 1 in 100 words in English starts with the letter J, but 13.37%, so 1 in 7-ish babies' names starts with the letter J. So that's a real weird sort of discrepancy, and that's a story that I was interested in. I wanted to know why that happened. So the first thing I thought about was, wait, I'm being a bit simplistic here. That's not actually saying that the names themselves are that much more popular, because a name like James, a name like John, those names are so ubiquitous across the world that actually those two names sort of account for probably 50% of all the J babies. So I thought, okay, well, I need to look at the other view as well, which is the number of unique names per letter. So that was the first thing I did, was I added in that, and you can see that it does drastically change where my J sits, although it's still very far above my symmetry line. So it is still an outlier, but it's not as much as an outlier as was before. And that's because if you look at it, 13.37% of all babies' names started with J, the names that were actually, I mean, the actual babies who were born, but only 7.6% of the names. If I just made a list of the names, ignoring how many children had each name, only 7.6%. So 1 in 12, or no, yeah, something like that. 1 in 12 people actually have that name. 1 in 13 maybe. So that is a different view. There's two different ways to look at it. Both of them are valid stories, but I thought that this was more interesting because I wanted to compare the number of words in English versus the number of names, unique names with a specific initial. So what did I do here? Well, a couple of things that I've added in here. Obviously, I've added in some symmetry shading to highlight certain points. So the idea here is that you will be drawn to the brighter colors, which are my outliers, J, K, U, and P. Those are my 4 real outliers. Z a little bit, but really it's J, K, U, and P. Those are my outliers. So I've used the colors there to highlight specific points that I want you to be aware of. And then I've added in another visual. And here you can see as you start working through you can start to create slightly more complex visuals. And in this case, I've used like actually a financial visual to show these differences between letters. So I'm only highlighting the real big changes. So J, as we said, K has a big change, R has a big change. So you've got these highlights the things that we are seeing. And then we tell the story. So in this case, the story is that the percentage of unique names beginning with a letter is largely consistent with the percentage of words in the English language. So most letters are falling within a fairly close band to the symmetry line. And you can see that really they do. They're not miles away. Even A, which looks like it's far away, it's only out by 2.5%. So there's not a big difference there. But there are some notable overrepresentations. And the interesting thing here is why. Why are they overrepresented? And those overrepresentations, J, K, Y, and Z, are specifically really what they're showing is the influence of the Hebrew language and the Christian faith over the historical naming of children, especially boys. And when you think about that, when we talked about the examples of the babies whose names are common, James, John, those are Bible names, they're biblical names, and that's where this overrepresentation comes from, because of the correlation with J or Y with the Hebrew the Hebrew word for Messiah or Jesus or God. So that's an interesting thing where actually you wouldn't think it has a big influence, but actually it has a very, very big influence. And then our underrepresented letters, U and P, I don't have any proof of this, but I suspect, based on what I looked at, I suspect that the reason that U and P are underrepresented, are because they are very, very common first letters for prefixes. All prefixes, or lots of prefixes, start with either a U or a P. So those are our various those are the various kinds of things you can look at when we add in data. So I've got one more thing to show you. So let's go back quickly to this talk and go to PowerPoint. So you would have seen when I was talking about that data, because I think that data is a little bit complicated, I created a tooltip and I hovered over it frequently to back up my points or to have the exact figures when I needed to talk about them. The second one, moving data. Sorry, I haven't showed this, but I'll as I said before, it's becoming more and more prevalent and more common. I'll show you an example very quickly. We've talked about color as a pre-attentive attribute. Using colors intelligently can help you emphasize your point and direct your viewers where to look. And then the last one is the emotional connection. And I'm going to talk about the emotional connection very quickly. I know we're running out of time. I apologize. So let's hop back into Power BI. I will show you my moving chart very quickly. I think that is, what is it? Sex neutral names. This one. So I just needed to load. Sorry, it'll take a second because this is quite a confusing, this is quite a complicated measure going on in the background to work out which names fit into this category. But basically, this is names that have changed over time, where they were either strongly male associated with males or strongly associated with females over time, and then they've moved. And you'll see that it's quite interesting if you watch these names that they actually move. And I love the fact that Sue is one of them. I don't know if you noticed it, Sue, because of course Johnny Cash was very adamant about the fact that naming a boy Sue is a really terrible idea, but yet it seems to actually have happened and be a realistic situation that actually happened. So here we've got our moving chart. For me, there was no other way to really present this data because I want you to see how something was something at one point and is now something different. And the only way I can do that is by actually having these bubbles move. And of course, you could filter down to a specific value and then run the chart and see what happens there. But the point here was when you have to make those choices, that is the kind of thing you can do. Okay. So my very last thing is to create an emotional connection. And this is my favorite part about this talk. And we're starting in the wrong place, James. Go away. So I love Friends. I'm obsessed with Friends. In fact, I'm about to finish watching it again on Netflix. I watch it while I work just so that it's in the background and thing. But I love the fact. So I wanted to see like what effect did this like cultural phenomenon, this pop culture phenomenon have across the names of the characters. So we started off with someone like Phoebe. Phoebe was an incredibly sort of nondescript name. It wasn't really very popular. There were 155 babies born named Phoebe in the year 1993. In 1994, Friends started, and basically the name Phoebe has got more and more popular ever since Friends started on TV. Now, I don't necessarily going to say that they're correlated, but the proof is pretty damning. If you presented that at trial, you'd get a lot of jury members to vote for the fact that it made a difference. Joey, very difficult to see with Joey, basically because Joey is often not a given name. People are more likely to call their child Joseph, Joe. There's all kinds of variations. So this one, a little bit difficult. It looks like it hasn't really had much effect if you just take the name Joey, but we could enhance this by getting variations, but let's leave that one. The name Chandler, obviously quite an unusual name, although not as unusual as I thought. In fact, more popular than the name Phoebe, which I was very surprised about when I first read about this. But you can see that Chandler, during the period of Friends, definitely reached the peak of its popularity. It's never really recovered since Friends went off TV. So people really loved it during that period. I think people who were having children at that time were really keen on it. And Monica is not a lot to say. In fact, it almost appears as though people got turned off the name Monica by Friends. So that's not great. But the story I want to tell you about, and this is because this has the emotional connection, is that the name Ross hit the height of its popularity 10 years before Friends started. 1985, Ross was as popular as it's ever been. It was kind of declining before Friends started. And then in the first year that Friends came, Ross grew in popularity. Ross and Rachel got together, season 2 and 3. Ross incredibly more popular than it had been in a couple of years. Ross and Rachel broke up and the name fell off a cliff. Like literally no one names their children Ross anymore. Last year, 93 babies were born named Ross, or not last year, 2018, 93 babies. So clearly the effect of Ross and Rachel breaking up had a big impact on the name. But what that suggests to me is that Rachel would have gone in the opposite direction. Surely when she and Ross broke up, she got more popular. But no, if you look at it, Rachel, height of popularity at the end of season 3 when they're together, as they break up, falls off a cliff as well. So that's the story that I'm going to leave you with. It has an emotional connection for me. I hope you, if you remember anything from this talk, I'm guessing that the thing you will remember is that Ross and Rachel breaking up was a huge point in the history of both of those two names, because it's something that you can relate to and you can use as a story. And I think that's basically where I'm going to end for you. I'm sure you all have to get back to work. So I'm available for questions if anyone can stick around. I'm sorry if I took up a bit more time than I planned to. I got sidetracked somewhere. I'm not sure where. But yeah, so thank you very much. And I hope you enjoyed that.
Thank you, James, so much. That was great. I can see that the name Priscilla is underrepresented, most likely. P. Does anybody have any questions for James? If nobody else did, I had a question, James, actually about Power BI, and you had mentioned QA. How do you find that a lot of customers want to use that feature, or no?
So when I present to people, when we are trying to convince people to adopt Power BI, and I show them Q&A, natural language processing, people think it's the bee's knees. They are super excited about it when I show it to them. But I haven't really had any big projects where people have really come up with massive use cases for it, where we've rolled out. We've got one or two cases where I've had customers who use Q&A, specifically, as I said earlier, about in sort of very high level reporting, where management execs can say something like, show me my KPI, my revenue number for the month, and it works. That kind of thing, they like that. But in terms of really using it extensively, I haven't had a lot of people doing that.
Okay, that's interesting. Anybody else have any questions?
Yes, hi, James. I actually have a question. There, I believe Power BI in the next release is gonna releasing a bunch of AI feature sets, and some of it's actually pretty amazing. You know, that you're actually able to click on certain graphs, and it's actually gonna give you the verbiage or kind of descriptor and identify outliers and things like that. Have you looked at those feature sets much at all, and just kind of want to get your thought on it?
So, I mean, some of those have already been in Power BI for quite a long time. Some of the AI type presentations, I'm just wondering if there's any that I have where I can use here. Let me go back to sharing for a second. Share tray. So if we look at this one, for instance, so if I look at just this report now, I haven't set anything up, but if you click on a chart on any point and you go down to this analyze, you've got these two things here: explain the increase and find where this distribution is different. So that is AI. That's already been there for many years. And there you see, I've just clicked on it and I said, explain to me what's happened, and it'll tell you what it can pick up from the model. Michigan, Texas, and Georgia had big increases in names, offsetting the decrease in Illinois. So this is not necessarily a very good chart to do that particular thing on, but you can see that a lot of this is actually done for you already. Now, there are a lot of cool Power BI. There are a lot of cool Power BI MI or machine learning, ML or AI features coming in. I know I've played around with the, sorry, I can't think of what it's called now, the decomposition tree, which is not necessarily AI in and of itself, but it has some AI functionality. I've played with one or two of them. I haven't really implemented them yet in production for clients, I'm not an analyst. I don't necessarily do that kind of stuff. I'm more on the side of building models, data modeling, data warehousing side, and building actual visualizations. So I don't really play in the ML space too much. But yeah, it's definitely something that Power BI and Microsoft are focusing on in terms of making a differentiator for themselves versus their competitors. Click and Tableau don't have built-in AI in the same way.
That's great. Derek, did you have another question?
Yeah, this is probably more general to the rest of the group. I'm actually looking at a Python project to look at some AI and machine learning modeling using the existing feature set that's available with Python and the Power BI. If any one of you have experience, I certainly would appreciate a contact, and it's just like I can reach out to you and just really kind of compare notes and learn from you guys.
Okay, thank you, Derek. So just contact Derek if you have any experience with Python. All right. Well, I know that we're running tight on time and we're over. So does anyone else have any questions for James, or have just any questions in general? Okay. Well, I hope everyone has a great rest of their day. And James, thank you so much for coming. That was really great.
It's an absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks. All right. Have a good day, everybody.
Cheers, everyone.
Bye-bye.